There's a photograph that shouldn't exist. It sits in a locked drawer at the Mount Washington Observatory, catalogued but never displayed, labeled with a date that makes no sense, and a location that defies explanation. The photograph shows a skier mid-descent on Tuckerman Ravine's headwall, captured in perfect clarity against the white bowl of snow. The skier wears modern equipment, carbon fiber poles, a helmet with a GoPro mount, boots that weren't manufactured until 2019. But the photograph itself, the actual physical print, was developed in 1967. The paper stock confirms it. The chemical composition of the developing solution confirms it. Even the degradation patterns in the emulsion confirm it. This photograph was printed 52 years before the equipment in it existed. The Forest Service won't talk about it. The researchers who authenticated it won't go on record. But the photograph remains, locked away with all the other impossible things that Tuckerman Ravine has produced over the decades, waiting for an explanation that will never come. They found the ski tracks on a morning so clear you could see all the way to the Atlantic Ocean from the summit of Mount Washington. March 17, 2023. The overnight freeze had created a surface like polished glass, the kind of conditions that make experienced skiers nervous and beginners suicidal. The avalanche forecaster doing his dawn patrol noticed them immediately. Tracks carved into ice 50 feet above the headwall of Tuckerman Ravine, in a location no sane person would ever ski, leading in a perfectly straight line toward the precipice and then simply stopping, not veering away at the last second, not showing any sign of speed checking or panic, just stopping, as if the skier had decided mid-run to simply cease existing. The forecaster radioed down to Pinkham Notch, thinking maybe someone had fallen. Maybe there was a body somewhere below that 600-foot drop, broken and frozen in the rocks. The search and rescue team assembled with the grim efficiency of people who've done this too many times before. They swept the entire base of the headwall with avalanche probes, checked every crevasse, and examined every suspicious snow formation. Nothing. No body, no blood, no scattered equipment. Most troubling of all, no impact crater. When something weighing 150 pounds hits snow and ice after falling 600 feet, it leaves a mark. Physics demands it. Gravity insists on it. But there was nothing. Just those tracks above, perfectly preserved in the morning ice, leading to the edge of the void and vanishing. The Mount Washington Avalanche Center documented everything with the methodical precision that has made them one of the most respected forecasting organizations in North America. They photographed the tracks from multiple angles, measured their dimensions, and analyzed the edge patterns. Standard protocol for any unusual incident. But these tracks match no boot pattern in their extensive database, which includes virtually every ski boot manufactured in the past 30 years. The edges were too sharp to be old, carved with a precision that suggested they'd been made within hours, yet no one had been in the ravine overnight. The ranger station was certain of that. They lock the gates at dusk, and while determined skiers sometimes hike in anyway, the overnight temperatures had dropped to -15 Fahrenheit, with wind chills approaching -40. No one goes into Tuckerman Ravine in those conditions. No one is sane anyway. By noon, the sun and wind had erased the tracks completely, smoothing the ice back into its pristine state as if nothing had ever disturbed it. But the photographs remain, filed away in the Avalanche Center's archives, with all the other things about Tuckerman Ravine that resist easy explanation. The incident report is labeled simply as Anomalous Track Formation Unknown Origin. It sits in a filing cabinet alongside dozens of other reports marked with similar euphemisms. Unexplained acoustic event, visual phenomenon, cause undetermined. Temporal discrepancy in equipment recovery. The language of bureaucracy applied to the impossible, as if the right combination of clinical terms could somehow make it all make sense. This wasn't supposed to happen. None of it was supposed to happen. Not on a day rated low for avalanche danger. Not in a location that should have been inaccessible, not leaving evidence that vanishes before anyone can study it properly. But Tuckerman Ravine has never particularly cared about what's supposed to happen. The ravine operates according to rules that were old when the first Europeans stumbled into these mountains, rules that predate human understanding and will outlast it. This is a place where the normal laws of physics seem to take on a certain flexibility, where cause and effect become suggestions rather than certainties, where the boundary between the possible and impossible grows thin enough to step through if you're not careful. Carved into the southeastern face of Mount Washington like a wound that refuses to heal, like something that was torn out of the mountain rather than shaped by natural forces. Tuckerman Ravine is a glacial cirque that defies easy categorization. It's not a ski resort, though thousands of skiers make the pilgrimage there every spring, hiking for miles to earn their turns on slopes that would bankrupt any resort's insurance company. It's not quite wilderness either, despite the lack of lifts or grooming or any of the civilized amenities that make modern skiing a sanitized recreation. The Forest Service maintains a presence there. Rangers patrol it, rescue teams trained specifically for its unique hazards. What it is, perhaps more than anything else, is a threshold. A place where the normal rules don't seem to apply with their usual certainty. Where snow can persist into July even as the valleys below bloom with summer flowers. Where the weather can shift from crystalline clarity to deadly whiteout in the time it takes to click into your bindings. Where people keep coming back year after year, generation after generation, despite knowing exactly what waits for them up there in that white bowl suspended between earth and sky. The ravine sits approximately 1 mile below Mount Washington's summit, that notorious peak where the highest wind speed ever recorded by human instruments once clocked in at 231 miles per hour on April 12, 1934. The mountain generates its own weather systems, creates its own atmospheric rules, spawns storms that exist nowhere else on Earth, and Tuckerman Ravine catches everything the summit doesn't want. Wind-scoured snow from the alpine zone above piles into drifts that can reach 55 feet deep, accumulating layer upon layer like geological strata, each layer telling a story of the storm that deposited it. Ice forms in configurations that glaciologists still don't fully understand, creating structures that seem to defy the normal crystalline patterns. The bowl itself tilts at angles that make ski patrol professionals from Colorado and Utah shake their heads in disbelief. 40 to 55 degrees of sustained pitch, depending on which line you choose to descend, which route you pick through the maze of ice cliffs and hidden crevasses. If you choose wrong, if your edge catches on a hidden ice patch, if the surface transitions without warning from forgiving corn snow to unforgiving bulletproof ice, you don't just fall, you accelerate. You become a projectile subject to the same physics that govern artillery shells and meteorites. And 600 feet below, the rocks wait with patient indifference. Edward Tuckerman, the man whose name was eventually attached to this place, never skied the ravine. The idea would have struck him as absurd if it had even occurred to him, which it almost certainly didn't. Tuckerman was a botanist and lichenologist, one of the pioneering scientists studying alpine ecology in North America during the 1830s and 1840s. He came to these mountains to catalogue plants and lichens that existed nowhere else, species that had adapted to conditions more similar to the Arctic tundra than to the temperate forests just a few thousand feet below. He was documenting life clinging to the edges of survival in an environment that should have been too hostile to support it. The irony that his name would become synonymous with people voluntarily hurling themselves into that same hostile environment would probably have baffled him. But then again, every generation finds its own ways to court death in beautiful places. The Abenaki people, part of the larger Wabanaki Confederacy, who lived in these mountains for thousands of years before any European arrived, had their own names for these places. Names that have been largely lost now, erased by the same processes of colonization that erased so much else. They had their own understandings of what moved through these high valleys, what spirits inhabited the peaks, what forces shaped the wind and snow. They marked certain areas as forbidden, passed down warnings through generations about places where the boundary between the human world and the spirit world grew dangerously thin. The exact locations of these forbidden zones were never written down, never appeared on any European map. They were maintained through oral tradition, through stories told around fires, through the accumulated wisdom of people who had learned over millennia how to survive in these mountains by respecting what they didn't fully understand. When those people were forced from their lands, when disease and violence and the relentless machinery of westward expansion shattered their communities, that knowledge went with them, most of it anyway. But if you overlay a map of documented incidents at Tuckerman Ravine, The accidents and disappearances and unexplained phenomena that have occurred there over the past 2 centuries, with the few surviving fragments of Abenaki oral tradition about sacred and forbidden sites in the White Mountains, the correlation is unsettling. The places where the stories warn people to stay away align almost perfectly with the areas where the most inexplicable events occur. Perhaps it's a coincidence. Perhaps it's confirmation bias, humans being pattern-seeking creatures who will find connections whether they exist or not. Or perhaps the Abenaki knew something about these mountains that we're still trying to rationalize away with scientific language and risk assessment matrices. The first recorded death in Tuckerman Ravine happened on July 24, 1886. His name was Sewell Fonce, 15 years old, from Dorchester, Massachusetts. He wasn't a skier. The very concept of recreational skiing barely existed in North America at that time. Sewell was a tourist, one of the increasing number of city dwellers who were beginning to discover the White Mountains as a summer vacation destination. He had hiked up to the ravine with his family to see one of the natural wonders that was starting to appear in travel guides and magazine articles: the snow arch. Every spring and early summer, as the massive snowpack in the bowl begins to melt, water carves tunnels and caves through the base of the snow. These can grow to enormous sizes, creating cathedral-like spaces beneath the surface. The snow arch, the largest of these formations, becomes a popular attraction. People hike up just to walk beneath it, to stand in the cold blue twilight under thousands of tons of snow and ice, to take photographs and marvel at the raw power of nature, rendered temporarily safe for observation. Except it's not safe. It's never safe. The snow arch collapses every year, sometimes early in the season, sometimes late. The timing is unpredictable. Temperature, humidity, the structure of the snow itself, all combine in ways that make precise prediction impossible. Sewell Fonce was standing near the entrance to the arch, perhaps preparing to venture inside, perhaps just admiring it from what he thought was a safe distance, when a section of the roof collapsed. Tons of ice and compacted snow fell on him, killing him instantly. His body was recovered, buried with the sad formality that Victorians applied to accidental death, and everyone agreed it was a terrible tragedy, but also a kind of freak accident. Bad luck, wrong place, wrong time. These things happen. But Tuckerman Ravine had claimed its first documented victim. Not its first ever, certainly. The Abenaki surely lost people to this place over the centuries, though those deaths were never recorded in the written records that we now consider official history. And definitely not the ravine's last victim. That moment in 1886 marked the beginning of a documented relationship between this place and human mortality, a relationship that continues to this day, with a statistical regularity that troubles anyone who studies it carefully. The ravine takes lives at a steady, almost predictable rate. Not every year, but often enough. Not randomly, but not quite according to any pattern we can fully articulate either. As if the place has some kind of quota to meet, some bargain struck long ago that requires periodic payment in human blood and bone. By 1914, when John Apperson became the first documented person to ski down into the bowl, strapping on skis at the rim and pointing them downslope with what we can only assume was either tremendous courage or tremendous foolishness. The stage was set for Tuckerman Ravine to become something new. Not just a geographical feature, or a botanical study site, or even a natural hazard to be avoided, but a proving ground, a place where a certain type of person could test themselves against conditions that made no concessions to human frailty. Apperson survived his descent, though historical records don't preserve whether he was graceful or terrified, or something in between. But he opened a door that would never fully close. He showed that it could be done. And once something can be done, there will always be people compelled to do it, to push it further, to find out exactly where the boundary between possible and impossible actually lies. The Harvard and Dartmouth students, who began treating the ravine as their personal playground, in the 1920s and 30s, were a particular breed, young men mostly, from wealthy families with access to education and leisure time that the vast majority of Americans didn't have. They would take the train up from Boston, or drive from Hanover in cars that were themselves still relatively novel pieces of technology, hike for hours through snow that could be waist-deep or higher, carrying skis that were essentially just long wooden planks with leather straps. No metal edges, no proper bindings, certainly no safety equipment beyond whatever they could improvise. And then they would point those skis down slopes that dropped away at angles that looked nearly vertical from above, on snow conditions that ranged from perfect corn to concrete hard ice, with no real way to control their speed beyond making desperate turns and hoping physics would cooperate. No helmets, no avalanche beacons, no cell phones to call for help if something went wrong. Just youth and confidence, and the kind of immortality that young men often feel right up until the moment they discover they're not immortal at all. The races started in 1933. The American Inferno, they called it, a deliberate echo of the Inferno Rennen in Switzerland, one of the classic extreme ski races in the Alps. The American version was a 4.2-mile course from the summit of Mount Washington down to the base, dropping over 4,000 vertical feet, much of it through Tuckerman Ravine itself. It required not just skiing ability, but also mountaineering skills, route finding in conditions that could change minute by minute, and a tolerance for risk that would make modern ski racing officials faint. Hollis Phillips won the first American Inferno in 14 minutes and 41 seconds. Dick Durrance, who would go on to become one of the most famous American skiers of his generation, won the following year in 12 minutes and 35 seconds. Fast times, frighteningly fast times for the equipment and conditions. But nothing compared to what happened in 1939, April 16, 1939, the third running of the American Inferno. Weather at the summit was marginal at best, visibility reduced to near whiteout conditions by blowing snow, winds gusting to 60 miles per hour. The kind of conditions that should have prompted a cancellation, but this was an era before race organizers worried quite so much about liability and safety protocols. Most racers picked their way carefully down toward the ravine, making controlled turns, checking their speed, trying to maintain some semblance of safety even while racing. The smart approach, the prudent approach. Tony Matt, 19 years old, recently arrived from Austria, where he'd grown up skiing in the Alps, had other ideas. Or maybe he had no ideas at all. Maybe it was just instinct. Maybe it was momentum. Maybe it was the particular kind of temporary insanity that sometimes grips people at altitude, when adrenaline and oxygen deprivation and competition all combine in unfortunate ways. As Matt approached the lip of the headwall, that moment where the relatively gentle upper slopes transition to the vertiginous plunge into the bowl, he made a decision that should have killed him. Instead of making the sharp traverse that would send him across the face of the headwall, instead of picking a careful line through the safest parts of the descent, he pointed his skis straight down the fall line and committed. No turns, no speed checks, no safety margin whatsoever. Just gravity and 2 wooden planks with leather straps and whatever. God's watch over fools and 19-year-olds witnesses, who were positioned down in the ravine, said you could hear his skis chattering on the ice all the way at the bottom, a sound like machine gun fire echoing off the walls of the bowl. They said he hit 85 miles per hour. They said it was impossible. They said he should have died. Every reasonable expectation suggested that he would catch an edge or hit an unexpected patch of ice, or simply lose control at those speeds on that pitch with that equipment. And when any of those things happened, the result would be catastrophic. A tumbling, accelerating fall down hundreds of feet of ice and rock that would end with a broken body at the bottom. But Matt made it. He stayed upright through the entire descent, somehow maintaining enough control to avoid the worst hazards, while essentially free-falling down the mountain on skis. He completed the entire course from summit to base in 6 minutes and 29 seconds, a time that stood as a record for decades, a time that some argue has never been legitimately beaten. Matt himself would later say, with the perspective that comes from surviving your own youthful stupidity, that he was fortunate to be 19, too young to fully appreciate the danger, and to have strong enough legs to somehow stay upright through the chaos. He lived to be 92 years old, dying peacefully in his sleep in New York, having survived one of the most audacious descents in skiing history. The American Inferno was never held again. The race that had started with such excitement and alpine glamour ended in the wake of Matt's Schuss, killed not by tragedy, but by the realization that they'd been lucky. That someone could have died. That someone probably should have died. That continuing to organize races down Tuckerman Ravine was inviting disaster, with the kind of formality usually reserved for wedding invitations. So they stopped. The race ended. But Tony Matt's schuss became legend, the kind of story that grows with each retelling, that draws people to places they probably shouldn't go. That makes young skiers think maybe they could do it too. Maybe they could be the next one to point their skis straight down and let gravity do the work. Every spring since, as the snow softens and the days grow longer and the corn snow forms in that perfect state between frozen and melted, they come. Weekend warriors from Boston, driving up Friday night and returning Sunday with sunburns and sore legs and stories to tell at work. College kids from Dartmouth and UVM and every other school in New England with a ski team or outing club, treating Tuckerman as a rite of passage. Locals who know better, who've seen what the ravine can do, but who can't stay away because once you've skied it, once you've experienced that particular combination of fear and exhilaration and achievement, regular skiing feels disappointingly tame. They hike the 3 miles from Pinkham Notch Visitor Center, their skis strapped to their backs, their legs burning by the time they reach the bowl, their excitement building with every step despite the exhaustion. Some years the ravine is kind. The weather holds stable. The corn snow forms perfectly in that magical consistency, where it's soft enough to carve through but firm enough to support your weight, not too wet and not too icy. People ski from dawn to dusk, hiking back up for lap after lap, pushing their limits but staying within that sweet spot where challenge doesn't cross over into genuine danger. The biggest injuries are sunburns from the intense high-altitude sun and hangovers from the impromptu parties that break out on the rocks they call lunch rocks, where skiers congregate between runs to eat, drink, brag, and bond over their shared experience. Those are the good years, the years that keep people coming back, that create the memories that sustain enthusiasm through the off-season. Other years, the ravine shows its teeth. The snow conditions are variable, transitioning without warning from soft to hard, from predictable to treacherous. The weather turns, as it always can on Mount Washington, bringing in fog or wind or both, reducing visibility to nothing, making navigation deadly. And people get hurt. People die. The statistics are clear for anyone who cares to look them up. Tuckerman Ravine has claimed dozens of lives over the past century. The exact number depends on how you count. Whether you include people who died from exposure after getting lost in bad weather, whether you count the heart attacks from overexertion during the hike in, whether you include accidents that happened nearby but not technically in the bowl itself. But by any accounting, it's dozens of people who went into that ravine and never came out alive. February 26, 2023, a pair of skiers, both experienced, both with proper avalanche safety training and equipment, descended Central Gully, one of the main lines down the headwall. Conditions had been rated as considerable for avalanche danger, meaning avalanches were possible, but not necessarily likely with proper precautions. They checked the forecast, discussed the conditions, and made what seemed like a reasonable decision. Halfway down, something triggered. Maybe it was their weight on a particularly unstable section of snowpack. Maybe it was a shift in temperature that destabilized the bonds between snow layers. Maybe it was just bad luck. The snow fractured with the distinctive crack that avalanche survivors describe as the most terrifying sound they've ever heard. And suddenly the entire slope was moving. This wasn't a small slough, the kind of minor slide that experienced skiers learn to trigger intentionally and ski away from. This was what avalanche experts classify as a D2 slide. Large enough to bury a car, large enough to destroy a small building, more than large enough to kill anyone caught in it. The snowpack broke free and accelerated down the slope, carrying the 2 skiers with it. In avalanche terminology, they were fully entrained, completely engulfed by the moving debris tumbling in a chaos of snow and ice and their own equipment. One of them, the one who likely triggered the slide, somehow managed to make swimming motions with his arms, fighting to stay near the surface of the moving snow mass. When the slide finally stopped, having run out of momentum and piled up in a massive debris field, he was near the surface, buried but not deeply. He could move his arms. He could breathe. Within minutes, he dug himself out. His partner wasn't so fortunate. She was buried deeper, completely entombed in snow that had set up like concrete the moment the slide stopped moving. The survivor, despite his own injuries and shock, immediately began searching, using his avalanche beacon to locate her signal, probe to pinpoint her exact position, shovel to dig. Other skiers in the ravine saw what happened and rushed over to help. It took 15 minutes to reach her. 15 minutes under the snow, unable to breathe, the crushing weight of compacted snow pressing in from all sides. When they finally pulled her out, she wasn't breathing. They started CPR immediately, there on the snow in sub-freezing temperatures, with wind howling around them. The rescue helicopter couldn't fly in the conditions. The ranger had to hike in. By the time professional medical help arrived, nearly an hour had passed. Against all reasonable odds, they revived her. She survived. But that's not how these stories usually end. April 15, 2023. A snowboarder riding solo lost control on the headwall. It happens. Even experienced riders sometimes catch an edge or misjudge the conditions, or simply have a moment of bad luck where their body doesn't do what their brain tells it to do. He fell, and instead of sliding down the face where someone might have been able to self-arrest or at least control the fall somewhat, he tumbled into one of the waterfall holes. These aren't just depressions in the snow. They're voids, caves carved by running meltwater, sometimes 20 or 30 feet deep with walls of vertical ice. Once you're in one, you're not getting out without help. The walls are too smooth to climb, too vertical to scramble up. You're in a prison made of ice, and if no one saw you fall, if no one knows exactly where you are, you could die down there of exposure, while people ski past overhead completely unaware. This boarder was lucky. Someone saw him fall. Someone had rope in their pack. Someone knew the rescue techniques necessary to extract someone from a waterfall hole without triggering further collapse. They got him out. He had some injuries, hypothermia from being in contact with ice and shock from the experience. But he lived. Again, that's not how these stories usually end. For every close call that ends with everyone going home, there are the ones that don't. The ones where the fall is just a little different, where the impact is just a little harder, where help arrives just a little too late. The Mount Washington Avalanche Center, one of only 2 dedicated avalanche forecasting operations in the eastern United States, tracks every incident meticulously. Every accident, every close call, every fatality. Their reports read like cautionary tales, compiled with the clinical precision necessary for scientific analysis, but unable to fully strip away the human tragedy embedded in the data. Each incident follows a depressingly similar pattern. Someone underestimated the conditions. Someone ignored the warning signs. Someone thought they were the exception to the rules that govern steep snow and human flesh. Someone thought it wouldn't happen to them, and then it did. But the avalanches and the falls, the documented accidents with clear causes and predictable outcomes, those are only part of what makes Tuckerman Ravine such a peculiar place. There's something else up there, something harder to quantify, harder to put in an official report, harder to explain to people who haven't experienced it themselves. Call it atmosphere, call it energy, call it the weight of history. Call it whatever makes you comfortable. But ask anyone who spends significant time in that ravine, anyone who's done more than just the occasional spring ski day, and they'll tell you. There's something about that place that doesn't feel entirely natural. Something that makes the hair on your neck stand up, even on clear days when nothing is obviously wrong. Something that makes you look over your shoulder, even when you know you're alone. Rangers who patrol the ravine, the Forest Service employees who've made it their job to keep people safe in that environment, speak in very careful terms about what they've witnessed over the years. They're trained observers, professionally skeptical, not given to flights of fancy or supernatural speculation. But off the record, after a few beers at the end of the season when they're tired and honest, they'll tell you about lights where there shouldn't be lights, not headlamps from other skiers, not reflections from the stars or moon, just lights, moving through the bowl at night when the gates are locked and no one should be there. Sounds that don't match any natural phenomenon they know. Not the wind, which they're intimately familiar with in all its variations. Not avalanches or rockfalls or animals. Just sounds. Voices sometimes, though never clear enough to make out words. Music occasionally. Big band jazz from the 1940s, as if someone brought a radio that can only pick up stations from the past. Figures glimpsed in peripheral vision that vanish when you turn to look directly at them. Always dressed in old-fashioned gear, wooden skis and wool sweaters, equipment that hasn't been used in decades. They're there and then they're not, and you're left wondering if you saw anything at all, or if the altitude is playing tricks with your perception. These rangers will tell you about rescues that went too smoothly, as if invisible hands were guiding them to victims buried in snow, leading them to the exact right spot to probe even when the beacon signals were ambiguous and the search area was large. They'll tell you about accidents that should have happened but didn't. Skiers who by all rights should have fallen, but somehow stayed upright as if something caught them, steadied them, sent them safely on their way with a gentle push they barely registered. Marcus Rodriguez was skiing Tuckerman Ravine in April of 1987. This isn't a second-hand rumor. Rodriguez is a real person still alive who will talk about this experience if you ask him directly, though he's clearly uncomfortable with it, clearly worried people will think he's crazy or attention-seeking. He was traversing across the top of the bowl above the lip on a clear day with good visibility and stable conditions. About 100 yards to his left, he noticed another skier. Nothing unusual about that. The ravine is popular. You're rarely alone up there on good days. But something about this skier caught his attention. The gear looked wrong. Not just old-fashioned, but genuinely antique. Wooden skis with cable bindings, the kind you only see in museums now. A wool sweater instead of a proper jacket. No helmet, no goggles, just a wool cap and what looked like glasses. Rodriguez watched as this figure pointed straight down the fall line and committed to a direct descent of the head wall. No turns, no speed checks, just like Tony Matt had done nearly 50 years earlier. It was audacious enough to be memorable, even if everything else had been normal. But as Rodriguez watched, he lost sight of the skier as the figure dropped over the edge and descended out of view. Rodriguez continued his traverse until he reached a spot where he could see the entire ravine floor spread out below. He looked for the skier who should have been down there somewhere, either still moving or stopped to rest after that intense descent. Nothing. No one. The ravine floor was empty except for a few other skiers far off to one side. No tracks in the snow where the mysterious skier should have passed. No sign anyone had skied that line at all. Rodriguez skied down himself, confused, thinking maybe the person had continued past the flat bottom and into the woods below, though that would be unusual. He asked other skiers if they'd seen someone in old-fashioned gear. No one had. He hiked back up and examined the line where he'd seen the figure ski. The snow was undisturbed. No edges had cut through it. No one had been there. He knows what he saw. He's certain of it, but the evidence suggests he saw nothing, or that he saw something that doesn't leave traces in the normal way. Something that exists in that place, but not entirely in this time. The old-timers who've been skiing Tuckerman for decades, who measure their experience not in years, but in number of seasons, will tell you stories if you approach them right. Buy them a beer at the Irish pub in North Conway. Show genuine interest rather than skepticism or sensationalism. Promise not to use their names in any way they could trace back to them, because they have reputations to maintain and don't want to be dismissed as crackpots. And then they'll tell you about voices calling from empty snowfields clear as day, calling your name, making you turn around even though you know you're alone. About ski tracks that appear overnight in areas that no one could have accessed, that show up in the morning, after a night when the rangers are certain the ravine was empty. About the feeling of being watched from the tree line below the bowl, an intense sensation of observation that makes you constantly scan the woods even though you know black bears are the largest predators in these mountains, and they're invariably more frightened of humans than vice versa. Dr. Jennifer Hartley, who studied avalanche dynamics at Tuckerman for her doctoral dissertation in snow and ice science, set up an array of motion-activated cameras around the ravine in the winter of 2015. Standard research methodology. The cameras would trigger whenever they detected movement, capturing footage that she could later analyze for patterns in snow movement, wind transport, avalanche precursors. Most of the footage showed exactly what you'd expect. Snow sliding, wind blowing, the occasional skier passing through the frame. But on 3 separate occasions, all between 2 and 4 in the morning when the ravine should have been completely empty, cameras triggered when there was no visible movement. The timestamp showed activity. The motion sensors had definitely detected something substantial enough to trip the threshold, but the footage showed only empty snow gleaming in the moonlight. Nothing moving. No animals, no falling ice, no wind-blown debris. just emptiness that somehow contained enough presence to trigger motion, sensors calibrated to filter out false positives. Dr. Hartley included a brief mention of this anomaly in her dissertation, but didn't dwell on it. Han didn't want to undermine her legitimate research with something that sounded too much like ghost hunting. But she kept copies of that footage, and sometimes late at night, she'll watch it again, studying the frames, looking for what the cameras detected that her eyes can't see. She's never found an explanation that satisfies her. The rational part of her brain insists it must be equipment malfunction or data corruption. But she tested those cameras extensively. They worked perfectly. And all three anomalous triggers happened in the same general area of the ravine, a spot just below the lip of the headwall, where the Abenaki oral traditions, little survives of them, suggest there was once a boundary marker of some kind. There's a particular phenomenon that happens at Tuckerman Ravine that has been witnessed by dozens of people over the years, but that scientists struggle to explain. Sometimes, usually in the late afternoon when the sun hits the headwall at just the right angle, observers report seeing multiple versions of the same skier, not double vision, not a mirage or trick of the light in the conventional sense. Multiple distinct figures, all moving in perfect synchronization, all wearing identical gear, all carving the same turns at the same moment, as if they're all echoes of the same person existing in slightly different versions of reality. It happens quickly, lasting maybe 2 or 3 seconds at most, and then the extra figures vanish, leaving only the original skier, who usually has no idea anything unusual just occurred, who continues down the slope completely unaware they briefly existed in triplicate. The rational explanations are all there waiting to be deployed. Ice crystals in the atmosphere create refraction effects. Altitude affects brain function and perception. The particular way that exhaustion and adrenaline and high-intensity focus can make the brain process visual information incorrectly. Every strange sighting, every unexplained incident, every ghostly encounter can be explained away if you're determined enough, if you're willing to stretch the conventional explanations far enough. But the explanations never quite satisfy. They never quite cover all the details. They explain too much or too little, leaving gaps that require either faith in coincidence or acknowledgement that maybe something genuinely strange is happening in that ravine. Consider the case of the Tuckerman ravens. Not ravens the birds, though those are certainly present too, big and black and disturbingly intelligent, watching skiers with an attention that feels almost evaluative. The Tuckerman Ravens were a ski club from the 1950s. 5 friends from Maine who made the pilgrimage to the ravine every Easter weekend for 23 years straight. They had matching red jackets with a raven logo on the back. They had their own traditions and inside jokes and favorite lines. They were fixtures in the ravine for more than 2 decades, until 1973, when all 5 of them died in a car accident on Route 16, heading up from Portland for their annual trip. The car slid on black ice and went off the road. Everyone died. The small skiing community mourned them. People remembered them fondly. And life went on. The next year, Easter weekend, 1974, multiple witnesses reported seeing 5 skiers in matching red jackets skiing the bowl at dawn. Several people noticed because it was unusual to see a group that coordinated, and because those red jackets were distinctive. The witnesses naturally assumed it was a memorial, friends of the deceased honoring their memory by recreating the Ravens' annual pilgrimage. It seemed like a touching tribute. But when people asked around later at lunch rocks, trying to learn more about the memorial, no one admitted to being those skiers. No one had organized any memorial. No one could identify who the red-jacketed skiers might have been. The question went unanswered. Easter weekend, 1975, they were seen again. Same red jackets, same formation, skiing the same lines the original Ravens had favored. Always at dawn, always in a tight group, always moving with the kind of synchronized precision that comes from skiing together for years. By 1976, people were actively looking for them, and sure enough, they appeared. But anyone who tried to approach them, to get close enough to see their faces or ask questions, found they couldn't quite catch up. The red-jacketed skiers always stayed ahead, always disappeared around corners or over ridges before anyone could reach them. The sightings continued irregularly for years. Not every Easter, but many. Always the same red jackets. Always 5 of them. Always at dawn. By the mid-80s, the original Ravens had been dead longer than they'd been alive as a ski club, but the sightings persisted. Eventually, they tapered off. The last confirmed sighting was sometime in the early 90s, but there are still occasional reports, even now, of red-jacketed skiers glimpsed in peripheral vision, there and then not there. Skiing lines that the original Ravens pioneered, and that few people attempt anymore. The Forest Service doesn't keep records of ghost sightings. They're not going to put paranormal activity as a category in their incident reports. The Mount Washington Avalanche Center doesn't issue forecasts for supernatural phenomena alongside their avalanche danger ratings. But if you spend enough time at Pinkham Notch Visitor Center, if you drink enough coffee and hot chocolate in the cafeteria, if you listen to enough conversations between rangers and veteran skiers and locals who've been around forever, you'll hear the stories. The solo skier who was guided out of a complete whiteout by footprints that appeared just ahead of him in the snow, leading him safely back to the trail, prints that he followed for nearly half a mile before the weather cleared, and he realized he was within sight of the parking lot. And when he looked back, the footprints were gone, the snow behind him untouched. The avalanche victim who swears someone pulled him to the surface felt hands on his jacket, yanking him up through the moving snow, even though he was skiing alone, and the witnesses who saw the slide confirmed no one else was close enough to help. The veteran patroller who won't ski a particular line anymore, who changes color and changes the subject when anyone asks why, who finally told one trusted friend that something looked at him from inside a waterfall hole, something with eyes that reflected his headlamp in a way that human eyes shouldn't, in a color that doesn't exist in nature, and a shape that he can't quite describe, except to say it wasn't right. Madison Salzberg was 20 years old when she fell 600 feet from the lip on March 9, 2024. A junior at the University of Vermont, a star in the Army ROTC program, president of the Mountaineering Club. She had all the right experience, all the right training, all the right equipment. She'd grown up skiing in Vermont, had been coming to Tuckerman since she was 16, knew the mountain better than most people twice her age. The conditions that day were firm, icy, unforgiving. But conditions are often firm and icy and unforgiving at Tuckerman. That's part of the appeal, part of the challenge that draws people there. She'd skied in worse. Her partner had skied in worse. They'd both checked the avalanche forecast, discussed their line choice, made what seemed like a reasonable decision. And then something happened, something that made two experienced skiers, both with excellent edge control and mountain awareness, lose their edge at the exact same moment in the exact same place. They both fell simultaneously, which is almost unheard of unless there's an avalanche or some other environmental factor. But there was no avalanche. The snow didn't move. They just fell, both of them, as if they'd simultaneously stepped onto ice that appeared from nowhere. 600 feet. That's a 60-story building. That's a distance that gives falling objects time to reach terminal velocity. That's enough time to think about what's happening, to be aware you're dying, to experience every second of the fall. Madison's body impacted the rocks at the base. Her climbing partner somehow landed differently, struck the snow instead of stone, and survived with injuries that the medical reports describe as miraculous, fractures and contusions and internal bruising that should have been catastrophic but somehow weren't. Madison died at the scene. The rescue team that recovered her body did so with the grim efficiency of people who've done this too many times. Her parents issued a statement asking for privacy. The university held a memorial. Her friends posted tributes on social media. The Avalanche Center added her to the statistics. And everyone agreed it was a terrible tragedy, and that Tuckerman Ravine had claimed another life, and that people needed to be more careful up there. But no one could quite explain what happened. Two people don't just fall simultaneously for no reason. There should be a cause. Ice equipment failure, avalanche, something. But the investigation found nothing. Just two young skiers who fell and one lived and one didn't, and no satisfactory explanation for why, unless you listen to the whispers, unless you hear the stories that people don't put in official reports. Because Madison's partner, in the brief time before shock and trauma fully set in, before the morphine and the helicopter ride and the hospital stay, said something to the first rescuer who reached him. He said they weren't alone up there. He said something was skiing with them. He said he saw it in his peripheral vision right before they fell, a figure in red, moving parallel to them, closer than should have been possible. He said it looked at them. And then they fell. Later, after he'd recovered enough to give a formal statement, he didn't mention any of this. Said he couldn't remember clearly. Said the trauma had made everything confused. The official report contains no mention of a figure in red. But the rescuer who heard those first words, who saw the look in the survivor's eyes, she remembers. She won't talk about it publicly, but she remembers. There's a register at the ranger station where skiers are supposed to sign in before heading up to the bowl. It's voluntary, not legally required, but most people do it. It helps with rescues if something goes wrong, helps the Forest Service track usage patterns, and justify the resources they dedicate to keeping people alive up there. Standard procedure at trailheads across the White Mountains. If you flip back through the old registers, the ones stored in climate-controlled archival storage at the Mount Washington Observatory, you'll find something curious if you look carefully enough. The same names appear again and again, year after year, decade after decade. Not just similar names or family members with the same surname. The exact same names written in the exact same handwriting. Robert Hernandez from Hartford, Connecticut, appears in registers from 1962, 1978, 1991, and 2003. The handwriting is identical. The emergency contact number, formatted in ways that didn't exist until the 1990s, based on area code designations, appears in all 4 entries, even though the early ones predate when those numbers would have been assigned. Sarah Mitchell signed the register on May 15, 1969, the day she died in an avalanche above Left Gully. Her body was recovered, her death was documented, her family buried her. She also signed the register on May 15, 1984, and May 15, 1999, and May 15, 2014. Always May 15th, always the same signature, always listed as skiing alone. The Forest Service official position is that these must be pranks. People researching old accidents and signing famous names as jokes, morbid humor of the kind that sometimes develops in outdoor communities as a coping mechanism for constant proximity to death. It has to be that. The alternative doesn't bear thinking about. But forensic document analysis done by researchers who got access to the registers tells a different story. The ink degradation patterns are consistent with the stated dates. Different entries show different levels of fading and chemical breakdown, consistent with their supposed age. The paper stock matches what was in use at the time each entry was made. And the pressure patterns in the handwriting, the way the pen pressed into the paper, suggest genuine signatures written in the moment, not careful forgeries copied from historical records. Someone signed those registers. The question isn't whether it happened. The question is who signed them, and from when time moves strangely on Mount Washington. This isn't mysticism. It's documented meteorology. Weather systems develop and dissipate in minutes instead of hours. The mountain creates its own atmospheric patterns that don't follow the normal rules of New England weather. Seasons blur together. Winter lasts into June. Autumn starts in August. The summit exists in its own microclimate, generating its own rules. Perhaps Tuckerman Ravine, carved into the mountain's flesh like a temporal wound, like a scar that never properly healed, inherits some of that strangeness. Perhaps the normal flow of cause and effect, the linear progression from past to present to future, gets disrupted in the bowl. Perhaps time doesn't flow there so much as it pools and eddies, like the wind that circles endlessly between the walls, trapped in patterns that repeat without ever quite resolving. Every spring, as the snow cones form and the sun climbs higher, and the parking lots at Pinkham Notch fill with cars bearing ski racks and mountain bikes and the accumulated gear of people seeking something they can't find in their regular lives, the cycle continues. New skiers make the pilgrimage. Old legends are retold with varying levels of accuracy. Fresh tracks appear in impossible places and are photographed before the sun erases them. The register fills with names, some of them current, some of them perhaps not. The mountain watches with the patient indifference of geological time. The ravine waits with something that might be patience or might be hunger. And somewhere between the summit and the valley floor, between the documented past and the uncertain present, between the possible and the impossible, people continue to fall and fly to survive and die, and sometimes to disappear entirely into the white as if they never existed at all. They found Brian Tessier's GoPro camera in the spring of 2022, melting out of the snowpack near the base of Right Gully. This sounds routine. Skiers lose equipment all the time. It gets dropped or falls off during a crash, gets buried in snow, emerges months or years later as the snowpack melts. They accept Brian Tessier died in an avalanche in January 1998, 24 years earlier. And GoPro as a company wasn't founded until 2002, 4 years after his death. The camera didn't exist in any form when he died. This should have been the end of it. Someone else lost the camera. The name attribution was wrong. Simple mistake, except the memory card inside the camera contained footage, and the footage showed Tuckerman Ravine from a perspective no living person has ever described. From above, hundreds of feet in the air, circling slowly as if the camera was mounted on a drone, or held by something flying, looking down at the bowl from an impossible vantage point. The footage shows skiers moving across the snow like insects, tiny and vulnerable. And the timestamp on the file reads April 16, 1939, the exact date of Tony Matt's famous Schuss. The Forest Service has the camera now, locked away with all the other things they don't know what to do with. They don't discuss it. They won't confirm it exists if you ask directly. But through networks of people who know people, through unofficial channels, if you know who to ask and how to ask, you can learn about it. And you can learn about the other things they've found melting out of the snow over the years. Cell phones showing text messages, time-stamped from years before the phones were manufactured. GPS units displaying coordinates that don't correspond to any location on any map, as if they're reading latitude and longitude from somewhere else entirely. A digital avalanche beacon, still transmitting its emergency signal when it was found, buried under a layer of snow that dendrochronology and ice core analysis dated to 1964, 8 years before avalanche beacons were invented. What calls people back to Tuckerman Ravine year after year, generation after generation? Is it really just skiing? The challenge of the terrain, the quality of the corn snow in spring, the bragging rights of having skied one of the most infamous slopes in the East? Or is it something else? Something that whispers at frequencies we can barely hear, that pulls at parts of us we don't fully understand, that promises revelation or transformation, or simply an escape from the ordinary rules that govern ordinary places, something that knows our names before we sign the register, that remembers us from visits we haven't made yet, that watches us with an attention that feels almost personal. The answer might be hidden in those missing hours, those gaps in the registers where the timelines don't quite add up, those names that appear and disappear across decades, like entries in a guest book for a hotel that exists outside normal time. Or the answer might be in the simple fact that some places on Earth exist outside our ability to fully comprehend them, places where the possible and impossible aren't opposites, but neighbors that occasionally exchange visits, places where you can ski straight down a 50-degree slope at 85 miles per hour on wooden skis and survive to become a legend, places where you can fall 60 feet and walk away without a scratch, or fall 600 feet and leave nothing but questions. The mountain remembers everything. Every skier who's ever pointed downslope and committed. Every person stood at the lip and felt that pull, that mixture of terror and exhilaration that makes the heart pound and the hands shake and the brain scream both yes and no simultaneously. Every track carved into the snow, every prayer whispered before a descent, every scream during a fall, every moment of triumph, and every second of agony. The mountain remembers it all with the perfect fidelity of stone and ice, storing the information in ways we don't have instruments to measure. In substrates we don't have languages to describe. The ravine forgets nothing. It keeps every story, every life, every death. It accumulates them like the snow that piles up year after year in layers that never fully melt, that compact under their own weight into ice, so dense it's nearly glacial. And somewhere in those layers, frozen in time in a way that's both metaphorical and disturbingly literal, are the real stories. The ones that would explain everything if we could only access them. If we could only drill down deep enough into the ice and extract the trapped information. The stories of what really happens in that bowl when the conditions are right and the boundaries grow thin. The stories of where people go when they disappear without a trace. The stories of what looks back at us from the waterfall holes and what skis beside us in red jackets and what leaves tracks that lead to nowhere. What draws people to Tuckerman Ravine? What keeps them coming back despite the deaths, despite the danger, despite the warnings, despite the accumulating evidence that something about that place doesn't quite fit into our normal models of reality? Perhaps it's not a what but a who. Perhaps something lives in the ravine, has always lived there since long before the glaciers carved it, will always live there long after the last human has made the last run. Something that feeds on adrenaline and fear and the particular kind of joy that comes from surviving what shouldn't be survivable. Something that occasionally takes a life as payment for some ancient bargain we've forgotten we made. Something that more often simply watches, records, remembers, adding each new skier to its collection of moments and memories that span centuries. Or perhaps there's nothing there at all except snow and ice and the immutable laws of physics. Perhaps every mystery has a mundane explanation we just haven't found yet. Perhaps every ghost is just a trick of light and exhaustion. Perhaps every temporal anomaly is just bad record-keeping or equipment malfunction. Perhaps Tony Matt was just extremely lucky, and Madison Salzberg was just unlucky. And there's no deeper pattern, no hidden meaning, just the random chaos of entropy playing out on a mountainside. Perhaps. But if you've ever stood at the top of Tuckerman Ravine, if you've ever looked down into that white bowl that drops away beneath you like a portal to somewhere else, if you've ever felt that pull of gravity mixed with something else, something harder to name, something that makes your skin prickle and your breath catch, then you know better. You know there are places where the ordinary rules don't quite apply with their usual certainty. Places where anything might happen and sometimes does. Places that remember and watch and wait. The search and rescue teams are already preparing for next season. They're updating their equipment, reviewing last year's incidents and refining their protocols. The avalanche forecasters are analyzing this year's snowpack data, looking for patterns that might help them predict next season's conditions more accurately. The ski shops in North Conway and Pinkham Notch are taking pre-orders for new equipment, booking space in their rental fleets. And somewhere right now, someone is planning their first trip to Tuckerman Ravine. They're reading the guidebooks, studying the maps, watching videos of other people's descents, imagining themselves skiing those legendary lines. They're excited. They should be. It's an amazing place, but they don't know that the maps don't show everything. Can't show everything. The real geography of Tuckerman Ravine includes dimensions that cartography hasn't figured out how to represent yet. They say if you ski Tuckerman Ravine enough times, you'll eventually see yourself skiing it. Not a reflection in ice, not a memory playing tricks. Your actual self, displaced in time, carving turns you haven't made yet or already made years ago, depending on which version of you is observing. They say if you see yourself, you should follow your own tracks exactly. Match every turn, every speed check, every movement precisely. They say if you deviate, if you try to change the line or improve on what you see yourself doing, that's when accidents happen. That's when the timeline splits or collapses or whatever it does, when you try to change what's already happened or hasn't happened yet. That's when the ravine takes its payment. That's when you become one of the stories that people tell in hushed voices at Pinkham Notch, one of the names in the register that appears and disappears, one of the ghosts that guide lost skiers through whiteouts or whisper warnings about hidden crevasses. But those are just stories, just mountain legends. Just the kind of tales that accumulate anywhere people push limits and sometimes exceed them. Tuckerman Ravine is just a geological formation, just a bowl carved by glaciers 10,000 years ago, just a place where snow accumulates and people ski. Nothing more, nothing less, except for the times when it's something else entirely. Do you want to know what really happened to Madison Salzberg that day in March? Do you want to know what she saw in those final seconds before she fell? What her eyes registered that her partner's eyes might have missed? Do you want to know why two experienced skiers lost their edge at the exact same moment, in the exact same place on snow, that shouldn't have caused that kind of simultaneous failure? The answer might be buried in the rescue report, hidden in clinical language about snow conditions and impact trauma and time of death estimates. Or it might be in the whispers you'll hear if you spend enough time at the visitor center. If you listen to the stories the rangers tell each other when they think no one else is paying attention. Or it might be somewhere else entirely, somewhere between the fall and the landing, in that stretched moment where time dilates and possibilities multiply, and the mountain shows you things that can't exist but somehow do anyway. Next spring, when the corn snow forms perfect and firm, when the parking lots fill with cars from Massachusetts and Vermont and Maine and Quebec, when the pilgrimage begins again as it does every year, remember Madison Salzberg. Remember all of them. Remember every name carved onto memorial plaques, every tribute posted online, every person who went into that ravine and didn't come out. Remember that Tuckerman Ravine gives and takes according to rules we don't understand, can't understand, may never understand. Remember that some places on Earth exist outside our ability to fully comprehend them, that they operate according to logics older than human reason. And remember, if you make the hike, if you stand at the top of the lip and feel that pull, that mixture of fear and exhilaration, and something else that has drawn people to this place for over a century, remember that you're not just skiing snow. You're skiing through layers of time and space and possibility. You're entering a place where the past and future meet and sometimes exchange positions. You're stepping into a story that started long before you arrived and will continue long after you leave, assuming you do leave. Assuming you don't become part of the collection of moments that the ravine keeps frozen in its permanent archive. The ravine is waiting. It's always waiting. And whether you believe the stories or not, whether you think it's haunted or blessed or cursed, or simply dangerous in the ordinary ways that mountains are dangerous, one thing remains absolutely certain. Tuckerman Ravine will outlast us all. It will still be there when the last ski resort has closed, when the last ranger has retired, when the last guidebook has crumbled to dust. It will remain, collecting stories and secrets, names and memories, keeping them frozen in its depths even as the surface melts and refreezes, in an endless cycle that might not be a cycle at all, but a spiral, drawing us deeper into something we're not equipped to understand and never will be. What happens at Tuckerman Ravine? Everything, nothing, something in between, something outside the question entirely, something that can only be understood by going there yourself, making the hike, standing at the edge, pointing your skis downhill, and trusting in gravity and luck and whatever else might be watching from the white. But be careful what you look for up there. Be careful what you find, because Tuckerman Ravine remembers everything, forgets nothing, and sometimes, just sometimes, decides to keep a piece of you forever, frozen in time, skiing the same line over and over, caught between the fall and the landing, between the possible and impossible, between the living and whatever comes after, a ghost skier in a place where ghosts are just another type of visitor, no more or less real than anyone else.